It was a cold, rainy night in a small town. The wind howled, and the streets were empty as most people were indoors, trying to stay warm. A firefighter, a man in his early 30s, was on duty at the local fire station. He had been a firefighter for nearly a decade, and while he had seen his share of emergencies, nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. Around midnight, the station received an urgent call. A passerby had reported hearing faint cries coming from an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The firefighter and his team rushed to the scene, sirens blaring. When they arrived, they found an old, crumbling building that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. As they entered, the cries grew louder. The firefighter's heart raced as he followed the sound. In a dark, damp room, he found a sight that would stay with him for the rest of his life: 5 tiny babies, wrapped in thin blankets, lying on the cold floor. They were shivering, their cries weak and desperate. It was clear they had been abandoned. The firefighter's instincts kicked in. He carefully picked up one of the babies, cradling it in his arms while his team gathered the others. They rushed the infants to the hospital, where doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to stabilize them. The firefighter stayed at the hospital that night, refusing to leave until he knew the babies were safe. The next day, the story made headlines. The town was in shock. How could someone abandon 5 innocent babies? The firefighter became a local hero, but he didn't see it that way. To him, he had just done his job. Still, he couldn't shake the image of those babies from his mind. He visited them in the hospital every day, bringing small toys and blankets. Over time, the babies grew stronger, and the firefighter felt a bond forming with them, especially with one little girl who always seemed to smile when he held her. As the days turned into weeks, the babies were placed in foster care. The firefighter knew he couldn't adopt them all, but he made a promise to himself that he would keep an eye on them, ensuring they were safe and loved. Little did he know, this decision would lead to a revelation 2 decades later that would change his life forever. The firefighter returned to his normal routine, but the memory of that night stayed with him. He often wondered about the babies, where they were, how they were doing, and who had left them in that abandoned building. He had no way of knowing that the answers to those questions would come when he least expected them, and that they would be more shocking than he could ever imagine. For now, life went on. The firefighter continued to save lives, but deep down, he carried a quiet hope that one day, he would see those babies again. And when that day came, he would learn the unthinkable truth about that fateful night. Years passed, and the firefighter continued his work, saving lives and helping his community. But the memory of the 5 babies never faded. He often found himself thinking about them, especially on quiet nights at the station. He wondered if they were happy, if they had found loving families, and if they ever thought about the man who had rescued them all those years ago. One day, while off duty, he decided to visit the local foster care center. He didn't know what he was looking for, but something inside him urged him to go. When he arrived, he was greeted by a kind social worker who remembered him from the night he brought in the babies. She smiled warmly and invited him to sit down. "Those babies you rescued, they're all doing well," she said. "They were adopted by wonderful families. But there's one little girl who still talks about you. She calls you her hero." The firefighter's heart swelled with emotion. He asked if he could see her, but the social worker explained that the adoptions were closed, and he couldn't have direct contact. Still, she promised to pass along his well wishes. As he left the center, the firefighter felt a mix of joy and sadness. He was glad the babies were safe and loved, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his connection to them wasn't over. He didn't know it yet, but that connection would soon come full circle in the most unexpected way. Little did he know, the little girl who called him her hero would grow up to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. And the truth about that rainy night, the night he found 5 abandoned babies, was still waiting to be uncovered. 20 years had passed since that rainy night. The firefighter was now in his 50s, still dedicated to his job but slowing down a little. He had never married or had children of his own, though he often joked that the entire town was his family. Deep down, though, he sometimes wondered what his life might have been like if he had taken a different path. One afternoon, while shopping at the local grocery store, he noticed a young woman working at the checkout counter. She had a warm smile and a kind demeanor, and something about her seemed familiar. As he placed his items on the conveyor belt, their eyes met, and she smiled at him. "You're the firefighter, aren't you?" she asked softly. He was surprised. "Yes, I am. How did you know?" She hesitated for a moment, then said, "I think you saved my life a long time ago." The firefighter's heart skipped a beat. He looked at her more closely, and suddenly, it clicked. Her eyes, they were the same as the little girl who had always smiled at him in the hospital. "You're one of the babies," he whispered, his voice trembling. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I've always wanted to thank you. My parents told me the story of how you found me and my siblings. You're the reason I'm here today." The firefighter was speechless. He had often wondered about the babies, but he never imagined he would meet one of them like this. They talked for a few minutes, and he learned that she was studying to become a nurse, inspired by the people who had cared for her as a child. As he left the store, his mind raced. Meeting her felt like a sign, but he had no idea just how significant it would be. Because the truth about that night, the truth he had never known, was about to come to light. The firefighter couldn't stop thinking about the young woman he had met at the grocery store. Her words echoed in his mind, "You're the reason I'm here today." It filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. But it also stirred up old questions, questions he had buried deep inside. Who had left those babies in the abandoned building? And why? A few days later, he decided to visit the old building where he had found the babies. It had been years since he'd been there, and he wasn't sure what he was looking for. The building was even more rundown now, with graffiti covering the walls and weeds growing through the cracks in the foundation. As he walked through the empty rooms, memories of that night came flooding back. In one corner of the room where he had found the babies, he noticed something sticking out from under a pile of debris. It was an old, weathered box. Curious, he opened it and found a stack of yellowed papers and a small, faded photograph. The photo showed a young woman holding a baby, her face filled with sadness. The papers were letters, written in shaky handwriting, addressed to no one in particular. As he read the letters, his heart sank. They were written by the young woman in the photo, the mother of the babies. She described her desperate situation, how she had been abandoned by her family, left with no money or support, and how she had made the agonizing decision to leave her babies in a place where she hoped they would be found and cared for. The firefighter felt a lump in his throat. He had always assumed the worst about the person who had left the babies, but now he saw the story in a different light. This wasn't a heartless act, it was a cry for help. But the letters didn't end there. They hinted at something deeper, something the mother had been hiding. And as the firefighter read on, he realized that the truth was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The firefighter sat on the dusty floor of the abandoned building, clutching the letters in his hands. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the story they told. The mother's words were filled with pain and regret, but there was also a glimmer of hope, a hope that her children would have a better life than she had. One line in particular stood out to him: "I hope one day they'll understand why I did what I did, and that they'll forgive me." The firefighter felt a deep sadness for the woman. She had been alone and desperate, forced to make an impossible choice. But as he read further, he noticed something that made his heart stop. The mother mentioned a name he recognized. It was the name of a man who had been a prominent figure in the town years ago, someone who had been involved in a scandal but had never faced consequences. The letters hinted that this man was connected to the babies in a way the firefighter hadn't expected. Could it be possible? The firefighter's hands trembled as he put the pieces together. The man mentioned in the letters had been known for his wealth and influence, but also for his dark secrets. If what the letters suggested was true, it meant the babies weren't just abandoned, they were part of a much larger story, one that had been hidden for decades. The firefighter knew he couldn't keep this to himself. He carefully gathered the letters and the photograph and left the building. As he drove back to the fire station, his mind was filled with questions. What had really happened that night? And how was the man mentioned in the letters connected to the babies? He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: the truth was far bigger than he had ever imagined. And it was a truth that would change everything, for him, for the babies, and for the entire town. The firefighter knew he couldn't ignore what he had discovered. The letters and the photograph were clues to a mystery that had been buried for years, and he felt a responsibility to uncover the truth. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. He decided to reach out to the young woman he had met at the grocery store, the one who had been one of the abandoned babies. She deserved to know the truth about her past, and he hoped she might be able to help him piece together the story. When he called her, she was surprised but agreed to meet him. They sat down together at a small cafe, and the firefighter showed her the letters and the photograph. As she read them, her eyes filled with tears. "This is my mother," she whispered, touching the faded photo. "I've never seen her before." The firefighter explained what he had found and what he suspected about the man mentioned in the letters. The young woman listened intently, her emotions shifting from sadness to anger. "If this is true," she said, "then he's the reason my mother had to abandon us. He's the reason we were left in that building." The firefighter nodded. "But we need proof. We can't accuse him without evidence." Together, they began to dig deeper. They talked to people who had known the man, searched old records, and followed every lead they could find. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. What they discovered was shocking. The man had not only been involved in the mother's life but had played a role in the events that led to her desperate decision. The truth was darker than they had imagined, and it was clear that the man had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. But now, the firefighter and the young woman were determined to bring that truth to light, no matter what it took. The firefighter and the young woman worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and talking to anyone who might have known about the man's past. It wasn't easy, many people were afraid to speak out, and some records had been deliberately destroyed. But they didn't give up. One day, they received a breakthrough. An old friend of the mother had come forward, willing to share what she knew. She revealed that the man had been involved in illegal activities and had manipulated the mother, leaving her with no choice but to flee. The friend also had a letter the mother had written years ago, detailing everything that had happened. With this new evidence, the firefighter and the young woman knew it was time to act. They decided to confront the man, hoping he would admit to what he had done. They arranged a meeting, and when the day came, the firefighter felt a mix of anger and determination. The man, now older but still influential, was visibly shaken when he saw the evidence they had gathered. At first, he denied everything, but as they presented the letters and the testimony of the mother's friend, his defenses began to crumble. Finally, he broke down. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said, his voice trembling. "I was young and reckless, and I didn't think about the consequences. But I can't undo what I've done." The firefighter looked at him, his heart heavy. "You may not be able to undo it, but you can make it right. Those babies, those children, deserve to know the truth. And they deserve justice." The man nodded, tears in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes to make amends." As they left the meeting, the firefighter and the young woman felt a sense of closure. But they also knew their journey wasn't over. The truth had been revealed, but there was still one more chapter to write. With the truth finally out in the open, the firefighter and the young woman felt a sense of relief, but they also knew there was more work to be done. The man who had caused so much pain agreed to publicly acknowledge his role in what had happened and to support the 5 siblings in any way he could. The young woman reached out to her siblings, who had all grown up in different homes but had always wondered about their past. Together, they met for the first time as adults, sharing stories and emotions that had been buried for years. The firefighter was there too, watching as the family he had helped save finally came together. It was an emotional reunion, filled with tears, laughter, and healing. The siblings decided to honor their mother's memory by creating a foundation to help other abandoned children and struggling families. They wanted to ensure that no one else would have to go through what they had. As for the firefighter, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The bond he had formed with those babies so many years ago had come full circle. He had not only saved their lives but had also helped them find the truth and each other. The young woman hugged him tightly one day and said, "You've always been our hero. But now, you're also family." The firefighter smiled, his heart full. He had never expected this journey, but he was grateful for it. The night he had found those 5 abandoned babies had changed his life forever, and now, he knew it had all been worth it. As he looked at the siblings, laughing and talking together, he realized that sometimes, the most unthinkable stories have the most beautiful endings. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace.